When we think of the time of Jesus, most of us picture a spiritual scene: sandals, sermons, miracles, a distant religious past. Yet for the people living there, daily life was shaped not by theology, but by money, or rather its absence. The world in which the historical figure of Jesus was born was shaped by one of the most unequal economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever seen. It was a world where money, power, and history collided. And nothing was as simple as it seemed. At the very beginning of the Common Era, Judea was a point within the Roman Empire. Rome was practically the most sophisticated exploitive mechanism the world had ever seen. They conquered territories not to integrate them, but to feed the center. The purpose of the provinces was to transport wealth outwards: grain, silver, labor, a flow from the periphery of the empire to the heart of Rome. Judea was part of that periphery. This was important because Judea was not a wealthy place. It was rural, agricultural, and fragile. Most people made their living from the land. But I'm not talking about farms in the modern sense. Just small plots of land, just enough to survive. A bad harvest didn't mean falling snow, it meant starvation. And Rome didn't care. Rome ruled Judea with a mix of local elites and imperial officials. Kings like Herod reigned with Rome's approval. After his death, Roman governors like Pontius Pilate oversaw the region. Their job wasn't to raise living standards, but to maintain order and keep the flow of revenue. Taxes were the backbone of the system. And this is the disturbing part. Today we think of tax as something paid on income, profit, growth. Back then in Judea, taxes were paid regardless of the outcome. You paid simply for existing. Land tax, crop tax, poll tax, tolls on roads and markets. And then there were religious taxes. If you couldn't pay, the consequences were felt immediately. There was no IRS, no appeals process. Tax collection was outsourced to local contractors, tax farmers. These individuals paid Rome up front for the right to collect, then exploited the people to cover their expenses and profits. Exploitation wasn't a mistake. It was the incentive that kept the system running. Those who couldn't pay borrowed. Debt was everywhere. And unlike modern debt, there was no safety valve, no bankruptcy, no restructuring. Interest accumulated rapidly. The collateral was the land. A single bad year could plunge a family into a spiral from which they could never escape. It generally worked like this. The farmer sowed, the weather turned bad, the harvest failed. Taxes still levied. A loan was taken from a local moneylender, often a wealthy landowner, or an elite connected to the temple. Interest. The following year, the crop barely recovered. The debt remained. Eventually, the land was confiscated. The farmer became a tenant, or worse, a laborer, on what was once his own property, or simply disappeared altogether. This wasn't an accident. It was structural. Over time, land became increasingly concentrated in fewer hands. Large estates replaced small farms. Wealth clustered around elites connected to Roman authority and temple administration, while the majority sank into insecurity. The economy didn't just produce poverty, it reproduced it. And the state had no safety net. If you lost your land, there was no unemployment benefit, no social assistance, no public housing. The only buffer was the family. There was community support, but it was limited. When many people fell at once, the system offered nothing. Debt was not just a financial burden, but a social one. Losing land meant losing status, security, identity. Your family's future could be wiped out by a drought, a tax increase, or a single unpaid debt. This was the world in which Jesus was born. To be clear, most people weren't poor because they were lazy, immoral, or damned. They were poor because the system required them to be poor. Rome needed surplus. The local elite needed rent. The temple needed income. All this pressure fell on the shoulders of those least susceptible to error. This produced something else: tension. Judea wasn't a calm place. It was like a volcano. Rebellions constantly flared up. Banditry wasn't just crime. It was economic desperation. Groups emerged promising relief, justice, and an overturning of the system. Messianic movements don't emerge in times of prosperity, but in times of collapse. This is what modern audiences often miss. People weren't hearing metaphors when they heard sermons about debt forgiveness, freedom, justice, and upheaval. They were hearing the struggle for economic survival. The Roman system was designed to be efficient, not humane. It increased wealth with remarkable consistency. It tolerated suffering as long as order was maintained. Stability was more important than justice, income more important than lives. People worked harder and fell further behind. Productivity didn't translate into security. Growth lifted a few, but ruined the rest. And importantly, everyone knew it. There was no illusion that the system was fair. There was no belief that hard work guaranteed security. Just endurance, anger, and a hope. Something, anything, to break the cycle. This hope is where ideas become dangerous, because when a system is so constrained, even small changes feel revolutionary. Even words can destabilize it, especially words. To understand why the Judean economy felt so inevitable, one must look at the institution everyone believed they had to protect themselves from, the temple. Today, most people imagine the temple in Jerusalem only as a religious place of prayer and sacrifice. But economically, the temple was one of the most powerful financial institutions in the region. It shaped not only faith, but also money. The temple was at the center of a layered system. In one sense, it was sacred. In another, it functioned as a treasury, a bank, a tax authority, and a court. Every adult Jewish man was required to pay an annual temple tax. This wasn't symbolic. It was enforced. The tax was paid with a special silver coin, the Tyre shekel, because its silver content was fixed. This meant people had to exchange money to pay their religious obligations. Money changers did this, and it wasn't free. Pilgrims exchanging money, the trade in sacrificial animals. Even if you were poor, you couldn't escape the system. You'd pay with smaller offerings, but you still paid. Here's the crucial tension. The temple elite was deeply intertwined with Roman authority. High priests were appointed not by popular support or spiritual merit, but by Roman approval. Stability was more important than righteousness, cooperation more important than justice. Thus, the institution that claimed spiritual authority over the people benefited from the same exploitative logic that impoverished them. This created a silent paradox. The temple preached holiness, forgiveness, and righteousness, but its operations reinforced debt, inequality, and exclusion. Payment was necessary for access to God, sacrifice for forgiveness, and money for sacrifice. People noticed this. By the 1st century, discontent with the temple authorities was widespread. People felt this way not because they rejected the faith, but because they saw hypocrisy. Jesus didn't act outside this system. He spoke directly into it. When he said debt forgiveness, people understood it economically. When he said freedom, they felt relief. When he said the poor, they saw themselves, their neighbors. When he said the kingdom of God, they heard of an alternative order where the existing one was not final. That's why his words carried weight. But power structures are threatened not only by words, but by actions. Jesus didn't directly attack Rome. That would have been too quick. Instead, he undermined legitimacy, redefined value. He used language that weakened the moral foundation of Roman exploitation, and the temple's complicity. Economic language was everywhere in teachings. Debt, wages, workers, tithes, creditors. These weren't randomly chosen metaphors, but reflections of daily life. Then came the action that changed everything. The intervention in the temple. When Jesus overturned the money changers' tables, it wasn't just religious outrage. It was an economic confrontation. He was attacking not prayer, but the mechanism that tied access to the sacred to money. He called it a den of thieves. Not because of money, but because exploitation had replaced justice. This crossed a line. Rome could tolerate profit, teachers, even critics. What it couldn't tolerate was instability. And the temple authorities knew how dangerous unrest was at Passover, when Jerusalem was filled with pilgrims. Crowds plus complaints equals sign rebellion. The conflict was primarily economic and political, not theological. The system could tolerate suffering, inequality. What it couldn't tolerate was a narrative that caused people to question why this suffering existed and whether it was necessary. Because when people stop accepting debt as fate, it becomes harder to sustain exploitation. At this point, Judea was like a pressure cooker. Taxes, loss of land, debt, religious obligations, political oppression. Rebellion was not a question of if, but when. And Rome responded to oppression as always, with violence. What happened after Jesus was not the collapse of the system, but its further intensification. Within a generation, Judea erupted in a full-scale rebellion. In 66 AD, open rebellion against Rome began. In 70 AD, Jerusalem was under siege. The temple, the economic, religious, and political center of Jewish life, was demolished, stone by stone. Its treasury was plundered, the priestly hierarchy was wiped out. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed or displaced. Rome not only suppressed opposition, but also dismantled the infrastructure that made resistance possible. Then it rebuilt control on its own terms. This is the part that people often miss. The destruction of the temple did not end economic exploitation, it made it even more fluid. Roman taxation intensified, and land monopolization accelerated. Debt didn't disappear. It became more invisible, more bureaucratic, more absolute. In the short term, Rome won decisively, violently, and efficiently. But gaining control of territory is not the same as gaining control of meaning. Jesus was not a military leader. He did not promise a new tax policy or land distribution. He was not trying to replace Roman rule with that of a rival state. That is precisely why his impact cannot be measured by regime change. What he challenged was not Rome's capacity for exploitation, but the moral logic that made exploitation feel inevitable, deserved, and divinely sanctioned. By speaking of debt forgiveness, by placing the poor at the center, by undermining the idea that suffering was the body of divine order, he undermined something Rome needed as much as its legions: legitimacy. After the temple was destroyed, the system Jesus criticized did not disappear, but neither did his critique. In the following decades, small communities formed, operating on different assumptions: resource sharing, mutual aid, intragroup debt forgiveness, loyalty based on faith rather than land or status. These were not revolutions, but parallel logics, ways of living within the empire, but without fully belonging to its moral economy. Rome swiftly crushed armed rebellions, as it always did. But extinguishing this kind of challenge was more difficult because it didn't need land, temples, or treasury. It moved with the people, operated under pressure, and survived after losses. Over time, something unexpected happened. Rome never fully regained control of the narrative the people told themselves about power, debt, and legitimacy. By the 4th century, the empire didn't eliminate this alternative moral framework, it absorbed it. In doing so, it silently acknowledged something profound: authority could no longer rest solely on force. Moral credibility was important, even for power. The economy of Christ's time shows us something disturbing. Systems don't collapse simply because they are unjust. They collapse when the narratives that legitimize them become unworkable. Rome optimized exploitation, but it never fully repaired the moral crack that its dominance felt natural. The deeper lesson is this: economic systems wrapped in moralistic language are extraordinarily resilient. They withstand hardship, resentment, even rebellion. What they cannot withstand is a moment of widespread disbelief. The moment people stop accepting that suffering is necessary, deserved, or meaningful. History may not repeat itself, but it reveals patterns. And once you see how power defends itself not just with force, but with narratives, it becomes much harder to believe those narratives arose by accident.